believe there is no doubt whatsoever that the Church of Almighty God was not responsible for the McDonald's murder. And as mentioned earlier, none of the documents I used comes from the Church of Almighty God. All the documents come from official CCP-related Chinese sources. And from these sources, it's clear that the perpetrators of the crime belong to a different group. Confusion is possible because they use the word Almighty God, but for them the Almighty God was one divine soul in two bodies of the two female leaders of the group. So it's clear that's completely different from the Church of Almighty God that believes the Almighty God is a different person. So that's already the key difference, because believing in the Almighty God incarnated in a certain person is the core message of the Church of Almighty God. So if you call somebody else Almighty God, you are a different group. Second, the theology is different. The very theological idea which led to the horrific murder is the world is full of evil spirits, and you can detect an evil spirit in 3 seconds, which is why the poor lady in Zhaoyuan was murdered. She simply said, I will not give you my cell phone number, and they perceived her as an evil spirit that should be killed, but they didn't kill anybody except a dog before, but they identified really quickly other person's evil spirit, which is completely contrary to the theology of the Church of Almighty God. The Church of Almighty God, like all Christians, believe in the existence of evil spirit, but to discern who may be possessed by an evil spirit is a very serious matter and takes a lot of time, so not in 3 seconds. And third, the perpetrators were asked themselves, did you belong to that Church of Almighty God? They say, no, no, no. They even say, that's a fake Almighty God, and we are the true Almighty God. But that means 2 different groups. And also Zhang Fang, one of the leaders who was executed, she said at some stage of her career, she became interested in learning more about the Church of Almighty God, I mean, that large Church of Almighty God, but she couldn't find them because they were already too much persecuted and she could not find. So I believe the documents are crystal clear that the McDonald's murder was perpetrated by a different small group of people who used the name Almighty God, but really were a different movement and a different religion, so to speak. Well, I believe the CCP has public relation problems because it becomes increasingly well known in the West that they persecute the Church of Almighty God and other CAGO and even movements they do not classify as CAGO. And hundreds of thousands of people were put in jail. Several were tortured or murdered. And so they have a huge public relation problem in the West. Unlike other regimes like Russia, the Chinese care about their public image. They would like to have a nice public image as people protecting religious liberty. And so they need to justify the persecution. And so in terms of the Church of Almighty God, their strategy is not so much to deny the persecution, But to say the Church of Almighty God is a criminal group, they kill people, so it's justified what we do to them. And even we heard in China, they try to compare the Church of Almighty God to groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or terrorist groups, and say even in the West, terrorists are sent to Guantanamo or arrested, so we do the same. But the problem, of course, in the case of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, there is massive evidence that they kill people consistently. And in the case of the Church of Almighty God, it's mostly a phenomenon of fake news. And I believe there are studies enough, not only by me, to debunk the attempt to attribute the homicide in the McDonald's to the Church of Almighty God as fake news. And I'm confident that as long as other minor incidents, because let's face the truth, the big incident is always the McDonald's, the crucial incident. But as long as we scholars study other incidents, probably it will come out that many of them are also fake news.